In 1872, a British archaeologist named George Smith made a discovery that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about human history. While translating ancient Mesopotamian tablets in the British Museum, he found something impossible: a detailed account of a great flood that destroyed the world, written 1,000 years before the biblical story of Noah. But here's what kept Smith awake at night. This wasn't just one story. As he dug deeper, he found the same tale: a catastrophic flood, the destruction of an advanced civilization, humanity starting over, repeated across 200 cultures spanning every continent. The Greeks called it Deucalion's flood. The Hindus described the dissolution of worlds in the Yugas. The Mesopotamians recorded Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim. The Chinese documented Ganyu's flood. Native Americans, Australians, Polynesians, all of them remembered the same cataclysm. For 150 years, scholars dismissed these as primitive explanations for local floods, mythological stories with no basis in reality. But what if they were wrong? What if every ancient culture remembered the same catastrophe because they all survived it? What if these weren't myths at all, but fragmented memories of humanity's greatest disaster? The day an advanced civilization fell, and we had to start over from nothing. Enter Graham Hancock, a journalist turned archaeological investigator who would become the most controversial figure in ancient history. In the 1990s, while mainstream archaeology was comfortable with its timeline of human civilization, beginning around 4000 BCE in Mesopotamia, Hancock was diving off the coast of Japan. What he found changed his life. The Yonaguni Monument, a massive underwater structure featuring precise right angles, straight edges, and what appeared to be carved steps and platforms. Geologists dated the site to at least 10,000 years old, twice as ancient as the pyramids, from a time when humans were supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers incapable of monumental construction. But Yonaguni was just the beginning. Hancock began connecting dots that academia refused to see. Similar underwater structures of Cuba, India, and the Mediterranean. Advanced astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient monuments. Mathematical constants appearing in prehistoric architecture. And everywhere the same stories of a golden age before the flood, of knowledge keepers who survived, of civilization beginning again from ruins. The academic establishment came down on him like a hammer. They called him a pseudo-archaeologist, a fantasist, dangerous. His books were bestsellers, but his theories were banned from serious journals. Why? Because accepting Hancock's hypothesis meant something terrifying. Everything we've been taught about human history is wrong. Think about what that means. Every textbook you read in school, every documentary you watched, every museum exhibition showing the linear progression from primitive to advanced, all of it. Built on the assumption that civilization began in Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago and progressed steadily forward, Hancock was saying something else happened first. Something we forgot. Something that was destroyed so completely that only myths remained. And the physical evidence, if it existed, would be exactly where we'd never find it: under 400 feet of ocean water, buried under 12,000 years of sediment, eroded by time into unrecognizable formations that modern geologists would dismiss as natural. Before we go deeper into Hancock's claims, you need to understand the story he's telling, not the fringe details that get him dismissed, but the core narrative that an increasing number of researchers are taking seriously. 12,800 years ago, Earth was a different planet. Massive ice sheets, 2 miles thick, covered North America and Europe. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats roamed landscapes that would become our cities. And humans, Homo sapiens, had already been behaviorally modern for at least 100,000 years. with the same brain capacity, the same intelligence we have today. Then something happened, something so catastrophic that it left a scar across the entire planet, a boundary layer in the geological record that marks one of the most dramatic climate shifts in Earth's history. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas event, and nobody fully agrees on what caused it. But a growing body of evidence points to something that sounds like science fiction but is increasingly accepted as science fact: a comet strike. Not one massive impact, but a fragmented comet that broke apart and struck Earth in multiple locations across the northern hemisphere. The evidence is written in the Earth itself. At dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and Asia, researchers have found a thin black layer of sediment dating to exactly 12,800 years ago. This layer contains materials that should not exist in natural geology: nanodiamonds, microscopic diamonds that only form under extreme heat and pressure. Iridium, an element rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets. Carbon spherules, tiny balls of carbon created when organic material is instantly vaporized by extreme heat. Shocked quartz, crystalline structures that form when normal quartz is subjected to pressures only found in asteroid impacts or nuclear explosions. And magnetic microspherules, tiny iron-rich droplets created when rock is melted at temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Celsius. These materials appear together in this boundary layer at over 50 sites spanning 3 continents. The odds of this being coincidence are astronomical. Something hit Earth 12,800 years ago with enough force to create these signatures across thousands of miles. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposed by nuclear scientist Richard Firestone and his colleagues, suggests this wasn't a single impact but multiple airbursts and strikes from a fragmented comet. Think of the Shoemaker, Levy 9 comet that broke apart and struck Jupiter in 1994, creating impact zones larger than Earth. Now imagine something similar happening here, with fragment strikes across North America, Europe, and possibly Asia. The immediate effects would have been apocalyptic. Computer models suggest the airbursts alone would have created thermal pulses hot enough to ignite forests across entire continents. Evidence supports this. The same boundary layer containing impact materials also contains massive amounts of carbon, the remnants of continent-wide wildfires. They call it the black mat, a layer of carbon-rich sediment that appears across North America at exactly this date. But the fires were just the beginning. The thermal pulse from multiple airbursts would have melted portions of the North American ice sheet, which was 2 miles thick and covered everything from Seattle to New York. The sudden melting triggered what geologists call meltwater pulse 1A, a catastrophic flood event that released more water than all of Earth's current rivers combined. Sea levels began rising, not gradually over thousands of years, but in pulses, sudden jumps that would have been visible within a human lifetime. Coastlines that had been stable for thousands of years suddenly moved inland, and here's where Hancock's hypothesis becomes relevant. Where do humans build cities? Not in the interior, not in the mountains, on coastlines, near river mouths, in fertile deltas, near fishing grounds and trade routes. Every major city today sits on a coast or major waterway. 12,000 years ago, those coastlines were miles offshore from where they are now, under what is today 300 to 400 feet of ocean water. If an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, its greatest achievements would be exactly where we'd never find them. But the catastrophe wasn't over. The influx of fresh water from melting ice sheets disrupted ocean currents, particularly the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the system that keeps Europe warm despite its northern latitude. When this system weakened or shut down, temperatures plummeted. Earth, which had been warming steadily out of the Ice Age, suddenly reversed course and plunged back into glacial conditions. This is the Younger Dryas cold period. Soon 200 years of ice age temperatures that shouldn't have happened. The climate had been warming. CO2 levels were rising, the ice was melting, then suddenly temperatures dropped 15 degrees Celsius in some regions almost overnight in geological terms. Glaciers that had been retreating began advancing again. The warming trend that had been building for thousands of years just stopped. And across North America, 35 genera of megafauna went extinct. Woolly mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American lions, short-faced bears, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats. Gone. Not over millions of years, but within centuries. The fossil record shows them present, then absent. The extinction coincides exactly with the Younger Dryas boundary layer, and the Clovis people, the most widespread prehistoric culture in North America, disappeared from the archaeological record at the same moment. Their distinctive stone tools, which are found at hundreds of sites across the continent, suddenly stop appearing in the sediment layers above the Younger Dryas boundary. The culture didn't gradually change or evolve, it vanished. Now mainstream archaeology has explanations for all of this that don't require catastrophic comet impacts. The megafauna extinction could have been caused by human overhunting combined with climate change. The Clovis culture might have simply evolved into other cultures. The Younger Dryas cold snap could have been triggered by natural changes in ocean currents without any cosmic impact. But the impact evidence is there: the nanodiamonds, the iridium, the shocked quartz, the carbon spherules. These materials exist in a boundary layer at dozens of independently verified sites. The question isn't whether something hit Earth 12,800 years ago. The question is how big it was and what it destroyed. And this is where Hancock adds his controversial layer to the scientific hypothesis. He asks a simple question. If this impact occurred, if it triggered continent-wide fires and catastrophic floods, if it caused the extinction of 35 genera of megafauna and the disappearance of the Clovis culture, what else might it have destroyed? What if there was more than megafauna and Stone Age hunters in the blast zone? What if an advanced civilization had been building on those now drowned coastlines for thousands of years? What if they had ships and trade networks and astronomical knowledge and architectural achievements? And what if the comet impact and subsequent floods destroyed it so completely that almost nothing survived except the myths? The survivors, scattered and traumatized, would have had to start over. Their children and grandchildren would have grown up in a post-apocalyptic world, living in the ruins of something they barely understood, passing down stories of the before times of the golden age of the great flood that ended the world. Over thousands of years, those stories would become myths. The technical knowledge would be lost. The written records, if they existed, would have decayed. The cities would have been buried under sediment or drowned under rising seas. And eventually, you'd be left with what we have today. Flood myths in every culture, strange artifacts that don't fit the timeline, astronomical knowledge encoded in prehistoric monuments, and a mainstream archaeological establishment insisting that civilization began 6,000 years ago, because that's where the unambiguous evidence starts. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when you're looking for evidence in all the wrong places. Before we dive deeper into the specific evidence that Hancock and others point to, we need to understand why this theory faces such fierce resistance from mainstream archaeology. And I'm not talking about the obvious reason that it sounds crazy. I'm talking about something more fundamental, more institutional, more deeply embedded in how science itself operates. The current model of human civilization is beautiful in its simplicity. It's taught in every school, written in every textbook, displayed in every natural history museum. Humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago. We spread across the globe over tens of thousands of years. We lived as hunter-gatherers, following animal herds, gathering plants, living in small nomadic bands. Then, around 10,000 BCE, something changed. Independently, in multiple locations around the world, humans discovered agriculture. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yellow River Valley in China, the highlands of New Guinea, Mesoamerica. These agricultural revolutions happened separately, but they all led to the same result: permanent settlements. You don't need to follow the herds anymore when you're growing your own food. Settlements led to villages, villages led to towns, towns led to cities, and cities led to civilization. By 4000 to 3000 BCE, we see the first unambiguous civilizations. Mesopotamia with its cuneiform writing and ziggurats, Egypt with its hieroglyphs and pyramids, the Indus Valley with its planned cities and sophisticated drainage systems, China with its oracle bones and bronze working. This is the timeline: hunter-gatherers to farmers to city builders to civilization, linear, progressive, evidence-based, and it represents 200 years of archaeological work. Think about what that means. Since the 1800s, thousands of archaeologists have been digging, cataloging, dating, publishing. Tens of thousands of sites have been excavated, hundreds of thousands of artifacts have been analyzed, millions of data points have been collected, and they all support this basic timeline. The evidence for Mesopotamian civilization around 4000 BCE is overwhelming. We have the cities, we have the writing, we have the pottery, the tools, the temples, the artwork. Same for Egypt, same for the Indus Valley, same for China. The evidence is there, solid, unambiguous, peer-reviewed. Now imagine being a professional archaeologist. You spend years getting your PhD, you published papers in respected journals, you secured a position at a university, you teach this timeline to your students, you've built your career on this framework, your colleagues accept it, the textbooks confirm it, the funding agencies support research that fits within it. Then someone like Graham Hancock comes along and says, actually, there was an advanced civilization before all of this. It existed during the Ice Age, it was destroyed around 12,800 years ago. The flood myths are memories of this destruction, and we haven't found the evidence because we're looking at it in the wrong places. What would be your reaction? If you're honest, probably defensive. Because accepting Hancock's hypothesis doesn't just mean adding a chapter to the textbook, it means rewriting the entire book. It means admitting that the framework you've built your career on is incomplete at best, fundamentally wrong at worst. It means acknowledging that generations of scholars, brilliant people who dedicated their lives to understanding human history, missed something enormous. It means accepting that everything you've taught, everything you've published, every confident statement you've made about when civilization began needs to be qualified with, but maybe something came before that we haven't found yet. And it means opening a door that many academics desperately want to keep closed. The door to pseudo-archaeology, to ancient alien theories, to claims that contradict established evidence, to conspiracy theories about academics suppressing the truth. Once you start accepting that there might be a lost Ice Age civilization, where do you draw the line? Do you also have to take seriously the claims about Atlantis being a real place, about ancient Egyptians having electricity, about aliens building the pyramids, about crystal skulls and mystical energy fields? From an institutional perspective, this isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. Archaeology has spent decades fighting to be taken seriously as a science, fighting against treasure hunters who destroy sites looking for gold, fighting against pseudo-archaeologists who make unfounded claims on cable TV shows, fighting for funding in an environment where politicians question why we need to study old ruins when there are modern problems to solve. The last thing mainstream archaeology wants is to give credibility to fringe theories. So the drawbridge goes up. Papers proposing Ice Age advanced civilization can't get published in mainstream journals. The peer review process, which is supposed to filter out bad science, also filters out anything too far outside the accepted paradigm. Researchers who pursue these ideas find their career prospects diminishing. Graduate students are warned explicitly or implicitly that investigating these topics is career suicide. Conference presentations on these subjects are relegated to the fringe sessions or rejected entirely. And anyone who does publish on these topics outside of peer review, writing books for general audiences, gets labeled a pseudo-archaeologist and excluded from academic discourse. This isn't necessarily conspiracy. This is how institutional knowledge works. Science advances through paradigm shifts, but those shifts are resisted until the evidence becomes overwhelming. The idea that continents drift was mocked for decades before plate tectonics became accepted. The idea that asteroids could cause mass extinctions was ridiculed before the Alvarez hypothesis proved that dinosaurs were killed by an impact. The idea that bacteria could cause ulcers was dismissed before Barry Marshall literally infected himself to prove it and won the Nobel Prize. Paradigm shifts slowly. They shift when old scientists retire and young scientists with fresh perspectives take their place. They shift when new technology makes previously impossible observations possible. They shift when the evidence piles up so high that denial becomes untenable. And maybe, just maybe, we're at the beginning of one of those shifts right now. Because here's the problem the mainstream can't easily dismiss. The anomalies won't go away. Every year brings new discoveries that don't quite fit the comfortable timeline. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. What he found was supposed to be impossible: a massive temple complex featuring enormous carved stone pillars arranged in circles. The pillars, some weighing 20 tons, were decorated with sophisticated relief carvings of animals, abstract symbols, and human-like figures. The craftsmanship required skills that supposedly didn't exist yet. The organization required to build it implied a complex society with hierarchy, specialization, and surplus resources, and the dating was unambiguous. 11,600 years old, built around 9,600 BCE, older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the pyramids by 7,000 years, built at a time when humans were supposed to be primitive hunter-gatherers, living in small bands, following animal herds with no permanent settlements and no monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe shouldn't exist according to the timeline, but it does, and it forced mainstream archaeology to revise their understanding. Suddenly, the textbooks had to acknowledge that complex monumental architecture appeared before agriculture, before settlements, before civilization as previously defined. The discovery created a problem. If hunter-gatherers could build Göbekli Tepe, what else were they capable of? And if this one site hidden under a hill in Turkey remained undiscovered until 1994, despite being enormous and relatively accessible, what else are we missing? In 2018, archaeologists using LiDAR technology made another discovery that shocked the field. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of terrain, penetrating forest canopy to reveal what's hidden beneath. When researchers mapped the Guatemalan jungle with LiDAR, they found over 60,000 previously unknown Maya structures: pyramids, palaces, causeways, defensive walls, irrigation systems, an entire civilization hidden under vegetation. The Maya civilization was far larger, far more sophisticated, far more densely populated than anyone had imagined, and we missed it because we couldn't see through the trees. The ruins had been there all along. Archaeologists had probably walked past them, but until we had the technology to penetrate the jungle canopy, they remained invisible. This raises an uncomfortable question. If we missed 60,000 Maya structures, what else are we missing? The Maya existed relatively Recently, less than 2,000 years ago, they left stone buildings, they left writing, they left pottery. They are well within the historical period we're confident about, and yet we didn't know the true scale of their civilization until 2018. Now consider looking for evidence from 12,000 years ago, from a time period 3 times farther back than the Maya, from a time period where sea levels were 400 feet lower and all the coastlines where humans would naturally build have been underwater for 10,000 years, from a time period where any wooden structures, any organic materials, any non-stone artifacts would have completely decayed, from a time period where even stone buildings would have been weathered, broken down, covered by sediment, or ground into unrecognizable formations by glacial activity. If we can miss 60,000 Maya ruins under jungle canopy, how much could we be missing under ocean water? The scale of potentially undiscovered territory is staggering. During the last ice age, when sea levels were at their lowest, Earth had millions of square miles of exposed continental shelf that is now underwater. The entire Persian Gulf was dry land. The floor of the North Sea was a plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia in a landmass called Sundaland. India and Sri Lanka were connected. Australia and New Guinea were one continent. The coastlines where humans would naturally settle, near fishing grounds and river mouths and trade routes, are now 300 to 400 feet underwater, covered by sediment, scoured by currents, and completely unexplored. We've mapped less than 5% of the ocean floor in high resolution. Most of our ocean maps have lower resolution than our maps of Mars. The technology exists to do detailed underwater surveys, but it's expensive, time-consuming, and most importantly, the funding goes to conventional archaeological sites, not speculative searches for hypothetical underwater ruins. But here's what makes this even more frustrating for researchers like Hancock. When underwater structures are found, they often get dismissed or ignored. The Yonaguni Monument of Japan, discovered in 1987 by a diving instructor, features straight edges, right angles, what appear to be carved steps and platforms, and flat surfaces. Some geologists argue it's entirely natural, formed by erosion and tectonic activity. Others argue the precision of the angles and the arrangement of the features suggest at least some human modification. The structure was above water during the Ice Age, last submerged around 10,000 years ago. If it's artificial, even partially, it predates known civilization. But the debate has been stuck for decades because underwater archaeology funding is scarce and because any claim of pre-civilization structures gets labeled fringe. Similar discoveries off the coast of India in the Gulf of Cambay in 2001 and 2002 showed sonar images of geometric patterns and apparent stone structures 120 feet underwater. Artifacts recovered from the site were carbon dated by the National Institute of Ocean Technology in India to around 9,500 years old. But the findings were controversial, disputed, and further investigation has been limited. The Bimini Road in the Bahamas, discovered in 1968, consists of what appears to be large rectangular and semi-rectangular blocks arranged in a linear pattern underwater. Natural beach rock formation, or an artificial harbor or road from when sea levels were lower. Geologists disagree. Most lean toward natural, but the debate continues with no definitive conclusion. And off the coast of Cuba in 2001, advanced sonar equipment detected what appeared to be symmetrical stone structures at a depth of 2,000 feet, far deeper than the others. If they are artificial, they would have to be impossibly old, submerged before the end of the last ice age. Most likely they were natural geological formations, but they've never been properly investigated because of the depth, the cost, and because Cuba is politically complicated for US research vessels. So we have a situation where potentially important sites remain unexplored or underexplored because the academic funding goes elsewhere. because the technology is expensive, because the political will doesn't exist, and because proposing that these sites might be evidence of pre-civilization culture is career limiting. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Evidence for Ice Age civilization would most likely be underwater. We don't seriously look for underwater Ice Age sites. Therefore, we don't find evidence. Therefore, the hypothesis is dismissed as having no evidence. Therefore, funding doesn't go to looking for evidence. The circle continues. And meanwhile, on land, the anomalies keep appearing. The Antikythera mechanism should not exist. In 1901, Greek sponge divers discovered a Roman-era shipwreck off the island of Antikythera. Among the statues and pottery, they found a corroded lump of bronze that seemed unremarkable. It sat in a museum for decades, occasionally examined but not understood. Then, in the 1970s, X-ray technology revealed what was inside: gears. Dozens of precisely cut bronze gears arranged in a complex mechanism. When researchers finally reconstructed its function, they discovered it was an ancient computer, a sophisticated astronomical calculator that could predict the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, track the Olympic Games cycle, and even predict eclipses years in advance. The mechanism dates to around 100 BCE. The level of miniaturization and complexity in its gearwork wouldn't appear again in European technology until the 14th century, 1400 years later. We found it by accident in a shipwreck. If that ship hadn't sunk in shallow water near a route used by sponge divers, we would never have known it existed. How many other sophisticated devices existed in the ancient world that we've never found because they weren't lucky enough to be preserved in shipwrecks? The Antikythera mechanism proves that ancient people were capable of creating technology far more advanced than we give them credit for. It was dismissed as impossible for decades. Even after it was discovered, even after it was X-rayed, scholars were reluctant to accept what it was because it didn't fit the timeline. Ancient Greeks weren't supposed to have this level of mechanical engineering, but they did. So what else did they have that we haven't found or haven't recognized? Let's talk about precision. Modern manufacturing can create surfaces flat to within thousandths of an inch, right angles accurate to arc seconds, drill holes perfectly cylindrical and smooth. We have machine tools, computer-controlled cutters, diamond drill bits, laser measuring devices. Ancient people supposedly had copper tools, maybe bronze, stone hammers, and sand for abrasion. So explain the granite boxes at the Serapeum of Saqqara in Egypt. These aren't small artifacts. They're massive rectangular boxes carved from single pieces of granite, each weighing up to 100 tons. The interior surfaces are flat to within a few thousandths of an inch across spans of several feet. The corners are nearly perfect right angles. The walls are uniformly thick. To create these boxes, ancient Egyptian workers would have had to remove the interior granite with extreme precision, creating smooth, flat surfaces and sharp internal corners. Conventional archaeology says they used copper tools and sand. Copper is softer than granite. You can abrade granite with sand, but the process is incredibly slow, and achieving precision, flatness across large surfaces is extremely difficult even with modern tools. Experimenters have tried to replicate the process using the tools supposedly available to ancient Egyptians. The results don't match the precision of the original boxes, not even close. The internal corners are particularly problematic. How do you create a sharp 90-degree corner inside a granite box using only hand tools and sand? Modern right-angle grinders struggle with this. Yet the ancient boxes have corners that are crisp and precise. Then there are the drill holes. At various sites in Egypt, researchers have found cores extracted from granite, these cylindrical pieces removed when drilling a hole. These cores show spiral grooves indicating the drill advanced through the granite at a rate that modern diamond drill bits can achieve, but copper tools absolutely cannot. Engineer Christopher Dunn examined these cores and calculated that the drill was advancing through solid granite at a rate of 1/10 of an inch per revolution. Modern drills using diamond bits and high-speed rotation can achieve this. Copper tools with sand cannot. The conventional explanation is that maybe they had some technique we don't understand, some lost method of working hard stone. But that's just another way of saying we don't know how they did it, and if we don't know how they did it, maybe our assumptions about their technological capabilities are wrong. Let's go to South America. Puma Punku in Bolivia is part of a larger archaeological complex near Lake Titicaca. The site features precision-cut blocks of andesite and diorite, some of the hardest stones on Earth. These blocks have perfectly flat surfaces, precise right angles, and complex interlocking joints. Some blocks weigh over 800 tons. The precision is remarkable. Blocks fit together with tolerances of less than a millimeter. The surfaces are so flat and smooth, they appear to have been machined, and there are no visible tool marks. Mainstream archaeology dates the site to around 600 C and attributes it to the Tiwanaku culture. But the dating is based on pottery and organic materials found at the site, not the stones themselves. Stone can't be carbon dated. The blocks could be older than the culture that built around them. The precision of the stonework at Puma Punku doesn't match the technology supposedly available to the Tiwanaku people. They had bronze tools, maybe some copper. They didn't have steel. They didn't have the wheel for moving massive blocks. They didn't have draft animals large enough to pull 800-ton stones. Yet the stones are there, precisely cut and fitted, with some transported from quarries miles away. How? The standard answer is time, manpower, and techniques we don't fully understand. Maybe they used freeze-thaw cycles to split the stones. Maybe they used harder stones to pound softer stones into shape over years of work. Maybe they moved the blocks using log rollers, ropes, and thousands of workers. Maybe. But experiments trying to replicate the precision using these methods have not been successful. You can move large stones with primitive technology. You can shape stones with stone tools. But can you achieve the precision visible at Pumapunku? The experimental archaeology says no, not with the tools supposedly available. Now let's go to Peru to Sacsayhuaman, the megalithic walls above Cusco. These walls feature stones weighing up to 200 tons fitted together so precisely that you cannot slip a piece of paper between them. The stones are not rectangular blocks. They're irregular polygons, each one a different shape, fitted together like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. To create walls like this, you would need to shape each stone to match its neighbors with extraordinary precision. You would need to be able to lift and position 200-ton blocks repeatedly, test fitting them, adjusting, repositioning until the fit was perfect. The conventional explanation is that the Inca or pre-Inca cultures did this using stone hammers, bronze tools, and enormous amounts of diamond labor. But here's the problem: when the Spanish conquered Peru, they witnessed Inca stonework. The Inca were still building with stone, and the Spanish accounts describe their techniques. They used stone hammers to pound softer stones into shape. They could create respectable stonework, fitting blocks together reasonably well, but they could not replicate the precision of Sacsayhuaman. The Inca themselves told the Spanish that the megalithic walls were built by an earlier people, giants or gods. Before the Inca arrived, they attributed the walls to a previous civilization. Now you can dismiss this as myth, or you can consider that maybe the Inca were telling the truth as they understood it. Maybe the walls were already ancient when the Inca found them. Maybe a more advanced culture built them, and that culture was later lost or destroyed, and the Incas simply built around the existing structures. the precision stonework in Peru, Egypt, and Bolivia represents a capability that doesn't fit the narrative of steady technological progress. These aren't crude early attempts that gradually improve over time. They are sophisticated engineering achievements that appear suddenly in the archaeological record, persist for a while, and then the knowledge seems to disappear. Why would technology go backwards? Why would cultures lose the ability to achieve precision they had previously mastered? Unless the knowledge came from somewhere else, from an earlier source, and was partially preserved but not fully understood by later cultures. Let's talk about maps. In 1513, Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis compiled a world map using, as he noted on the map itself, source maps from earlier cartographers, including maps captured from Christopher Columbus. The Piri Reis map shows the coastline of South America with reasonable accuracy for its time, but it also shows something strange. The southern portion of the map depicts a coastline that appears to match the northern coast of Antarctica, not as it is today, covered in ice. As it would appear without ice, the map was dismissed as inaccurate for centuries. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820. How could a 1513 map show it? But in 1949, researchers at the US Navy Hydrographic Office noticed something. When they compared the Piri Reis map to modern seismic surveys that had mapped the rock surface beneath Antarctica's ice, the coastlines matched. The map appeared to show Antarctica's true coastline, the rock beneath the ice. Now, the skeptical explanation is that the map doesn't show Antarctica at all, but rather a distorted representation of South America's coast, cartographic errors that coincidentally resemble Antarctica. Maybe. But there's another map, the Orontius Phineus map from 1531. This one also shows Antarctica and shows it with rivers, mountains, and coastline details, again matching the subglacial features that modern surveys have revealed beneath the ice. Both maps claim to be based on older source maps. Piri Reis explicitly states he used ancient sources. If these maps really do show Antarctica without ice, the source maps would have to date from before the ice sheet formed, or at least from a time when parts of the coast were ice-free. The last time significant portions of Antarctica's coast were ice-free was at least 6,000 years ago, possibly much earlier depending on which parts we're talking about. So either these are coincidental cartographic errors that happen to match actual subglacial features, or ancient cartographers had access to very old source maps showing an ice-free Antarctica, which seems more likely. If you've already decided that advanced civilization couldn't exist 10,000 years ago, then coincidence is the only option. But if you're willing to consider the possibility, then maybe these maps are evidence that someone long before modern civilization was exploring and mapping the world with considerable accuracy. Then there's the Baghdad Battery. Found in 1936 in a village near Baghdad, this artifact consists of a clay jar containing a copper cylinder with an iron rod suspended inside. When filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, the device functions as a galvanic cell, producing about 1 volt of electricity. It dates to around 200 BC. Why would ancient people need electricity? The conventional answer is that they didn't, and the object isn't actually a battery. It might have been used for storing scrolls, the copper and iron being coincidental, but experiments have proven it works as a battery, and there are theories that ancient people might have used such devices for electroplating, coating cheaper metals with thin layers of gold or silver. Evidence of electroplated objects from the ancient world exists, though mainstream archaeology attributes the gold layer to other methods. Here's the pattern: we keep finding artifacts that demonstrate greater technological capability than the timeline suggests should exist. Each one individually can be explained away. The Antikythera mechanism is an outlier, a unique achievement that wasn't replicated. The precision stonework is just really good craftsmanship with lots of time and effort. The maps are coincidence or misinterpretation. The battery is probably not a battery, but taken together, they form a picture of ancient people who knew more, could do more, had capabilities we don't credit them with. And if they had these capabilities in the periods we know about, the periods where we have abundant archaeological evidence, what capabilities might cultures have had in the periods we know almost nothing about? Let's talk about mathematics. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2500 BC, encodes mathematical relationships that seem improbably sophisticated for the time. The ratio of the pyramid's perimeter to its height is almost exactly 2 pi. The ratio of its height to half its base length approximates the golden ratio phi. The pyramid's dimensions encode the mathematical relationship between the circumference of a circle and its radius. Now you can argue this is coincidence. The builders chose proportions that looked right, and those proportions happen to approximate important mathematical constants, maybe. But the precision is remarkable, and similar mathematical relationships appear in other ancient monuments. The golden ratio appears in the Parthenon in Greece. Complex astronomical alignments appear at Angkor Wat. In Cambodia, the temple complex encodes the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle caused by Earth's wobble on its axis. You can't observe precession in a single lifetime. You can't even observe it in a dozen lifetimes. To discover precession, you need centuries of careful astronomical observation, recorded and passed down through generations. Ancient Cambodian priests supposedly didn't have this knowledge, but somehow it's encoded in Angkor Wat's architecture. The same precession cycle appears encoded at Göbekli Tepe in structures built 11,600 years ago by hunter-gatherers who supposedly had no writing, no cities, no astronomical tradition. Yet they carve symbols that researchers argue represent constellations and astronomical events, including what may be a record of the comet strike that triggered the Younger Dryas. How did they know? Where did the knowledge come from? There's only one answer that makes sense if you accept the evidence. The knowledge was passed down from an earlier source. Someone before them had been watching the skies for long enough to understand precession, to map the constellations, to predict astronomical events. And when their civilization fell, some of that knowledge survived encoded in stone by the people who came after. This is what Hancock means by a legacy. Not that the survivors of a lost civilization directly built Göbekli Tepe or Angkor Wat, but that they passed down knowledge that influenced later cultures, that seeded the astronomical understanding visible in monuments built thousands of years after the catastrophe. The myths support this. Across multiple cultures, there are stories of knowledge keepers, civilizers, teachers who appeared after a great disaster and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The Sumerians wrote of the Apkallu, 7 sages who brought knowledge before the flood. The Egyptians spoke of Thoth, the god of knowledge who survived a cataclysm and taught the survivors. In South America, Viracocha was described as a bearded white figure who appeared after a flood and taught people agriculture, astronomy, and architecture before disappearing. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl filled the same role, appearing after destruction to teach civilization skills. The stories are dismissed as mythology, gods, and legends with no historical basis. But what if they're cultural memories of real people, survivors of the catastrophe, who possessed knowledge from before the fall and traveled to different regions teaching the survivors? Not gods or aliens, just humans who knew more than the people around them because they came from a more advanced culture that had been destroyed. The agricultural mystery fits this pattern. Around 10,000 BCE, agriculture appears suddenly and independently in multiple locations across the globe. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yellow River Valley in China, the New Guinea Highlands, Mesoamerica. These regions are thousands of miles apart, separated by oceans and mountain ranges, yet agriculture appears in all of them within a relatively narrow time window. The conventional explanation is independent invention. Humans in different regions figured out farming separately. It's not impossible. Agriculture isn't that complicated. You plant seeds, they grow, you harvest them. Hunter gatherers had been managing wild plants for thousands of years. The leap to deliberate cultivation isn't that large, but the timing is suspicious. Why does agriculture appear around 10,000 BC across multiple continents? Why not 20,000 years ago? Why not 5,000 years ago? Anatomically, modern humans had existed for 200,000 years at that point. Behaviorally, modern humans for at least 100,000 years. People with our brains, our intelligence. Why did they wait until 10,000 BCE to invent farming? One possibility is climate. The end of the Ice Age created more favorable conditions for agriculture. Warmer temperatures, more stable rainfall, longer growing seasons. Hunter-gatherer cultures independently recognized that the new climate allowed farming and made the transition. Another possibility is population pressure. After the Younger Dryas catastrophe, with megafauna extinct and traditional food sources diminished, humans needed new strategies to feed themselves. Agriculture filled that need. Or the third possibility, agriculture wasn't invented independently multiple times. It was known before the catastrophe, practiced by an earlier culture, and that knowledge was preserved and transmitted by survivors to different regions. The survivors didn't have seeds for every crop, didn't have written agricultural manuals, but they had the concept, the understanding that you could deliberately plant and harvest. They taught this to the hunter-gatherer groups they encountered, and those groups adapted the knowledge to local plants, creating the different agricultural traditions we see in the archaeological record. This is speculation. I want to be clear about that. There's no proof that agricultural knowledge was transmitted from a pre-Younger Dryas civilization. The evidence is consistent with independent invention, but is also consistent with knowledge transmission. And when you combine it with the astronomical knowledge, the mathematical constants, the flood myths, the precision, stonework, the impossible artifacts, you start to see a pattern of knowledge that appears too early in cultures that supposedly shouldn't have it, preserved in myths about wise teachers and golden ages before the flood. Is this proof of a lost ice age civilization? No. Proof would require finding cities, finding writing, finding unambiguous artifacts that could only come from an advanced culture, and those haven't been found. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when the evidence would be in places we haven't looked. The ocean hides more secrets than anywhere else on Earth. We've mapped the surface of Mars in higher resolution than we've mapped our own ocean floor. We've sent rovers to drive across alien deserts, but we've explored less than 5% of the deep ocean in any meaningful detail. And the parts we haven't explored, they're exactly where evidence of Ice Age civilization would be if it existed. 12,000 years ago, the world looked completely different. The coastlines weren't where they are today. Sea levels were 400 feet lower. That's not a small difference. That's the height of a 40-story building. Imagine standing on a beach today and looking out at the ocean. Now imagine that the water is 400 feet lower, the beach extends outward for miles. What is now underwater continental shelf was dry land, habitable land, the kind of land where humans would naturally settle. Because here's the thing about human civilization, we build on coasts, we always have. Look at any map of modern cities, New York, London, Tokyo, Mumbai, Shanghai, Los Angeles, Sydney. They're all on coasts or major rivers. We build where there's access to water, to fishing, to trade routes. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were at their lowest point, the most desirable real estate on Earth, the coastal zones where rivers met the ocean. where fishing was abundant, where trade routes would naturally develop. All of that is now 300 to 400 feet underwater. The Persian Gulf didn't exist as a body of water. It was a river valley, a fertile plain that would have been prime territory for settlement. Now it's completely submerged. Indonesia wasn't a series of islands, it was part of mainland Asia, a massive landmass called Sundaland that was larger than India. Sea level rise drowned it, turning mountains into islands and lowlands into ocean floor. The land bridge connecting India and Sri Lanka was above water. The entire floor of the North Sea was a plain connecting Britain to continental Europe. Australia and New Guinea were one continuous landmass. All of these areas, millions of square miles of formerly habitable land, went underwater as the ice sheets melted. The process wasn't slow and gentle. It happened in pulses, sudden jumps in sea level that would have been catastrophic for any coastal populations. Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred around 14,600 years ago, raised sea levels by 50 to 80 feet in less than 500 years. That might sound gradual, but it means coastlines moved inland by miles within a single human lifetime. Any settlements on those coasts would have been abandoned, then submerged, then buried under sediment. Meltwater Pulse 1b, around 11,500 years ago, right after the Younger Dryas period ended, caused another rapid rise. The process continued for thousands of years. Sea levels didn't stabilize at modern heights until around 8,000 years ago. By that time, anything built on the Ice Age coastlines had been underwater for millennia, scoured by currents, covered by sediment, broken down by the relentless action of waves and tides. If an advanced Ice Age civilization existed and built its cities on these coastlines, we would never find them unless we specifically went looking in the right places. And we haven't. Marine archaeology exists, but it focuses almost entirely on shipwrecks and submerged structures from known historical periods, ancient Roman ports, Viking ships, Spanish galleons, colonial era settlements that were built on coasts that later eroded or subsided. Nobody is seriously funding expeditions to map the continental shelves looking for 12,000-year-old ruins. Why? Because the academic consensus says there's nothing there to find. Ice Age humans were hunter-gatherers. They didn't build cities, therefore there are no cities to discover, therefore we don't need to look. Therefore we don't fund the research. It's circular logic that prevents investigation. But sometimes by accident or by the efforts of independent researchers, underwater structures are found that don't fit the timeline. And when they are, the reaction from mainstream archaeology is usually dismissal. The Yonaguni Monument is the most famous example. In 1987, a dive tour operator named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the waters of Yonaguni, the westernmost island of Japan. He was looking for interesting dive sites to show tourists. What he found was a massive underwater structure that looked artificial. Straight edges, right angles. What appeared to be carved steps, platforms, and terraces. The formation is enormous, stretching over 500 feet in length and rising about 80 feet from the seafloor. The features are striking. There are flat surfaces that look like they were cut or shaped. There are vertical walls with precise 90-degree angles. There are formations that resemble stairs or step pyramids. Some sections look like they could be roads or pathways. The entire structure has a geometric organization that seems deliberate, planned. When news of the discovery spread, it attracted attention from researchers, including geologist Robert Schoch from Boston University. Schoch, who had previously worked with Hancock investigating the age of the Sphinx, traveled to Yonaguni to examine the structure. His conclusion, primarily natural but possibly modified by humans. He argued that the rock formation is mostly the result of natural erosion and tectonic activity. The sandstone in the region naturally fractures along regular planes, which could create the straight edges and right angles. But Shook also noted that some features looked like they might have been enhanced or modified by human hands, particularly what appeared to be tool marks and some of the more regular formations. Other geologists, including Masaki Kimura from the University of the Ryukyus, argued the opposite. Kimura has spent decades studying Yonaguni and believes the structure is largely artificial. He points to specific features that he argues cannot be explained by natural erosion alone. A triangular depression that looks like it was carved, straight, narrow grooves that resemble tool marks, holes in the rock that appear deliberately placed. The debate has continued for over 30 years with no resolution. Here's what's not disputed: the structure exists, it's massive, it has features that look geometric and organized, and it was above water during the Ice Age. Geological studies of sea level rise in the region indicate that Yonaguni would have been above water until approximately 10,000 years ago. If the structure is artificial or even partially modified by humans, it would date to the Ice Age, before known civilization. But because it doesn't fit the timeline and because there's a possible natural explanation, mainstream archaeology largely ignores it. It's easier to say it's natural than to deal with the implications of it being artificial. The same pattern repeats with other underwater discoveries. In 2001 and 2002, a team using sonar equipment in the Gulf of Cambay off the coast of Gujarat, India, detected what appeared to be geometric structures on the ocean floor at a depth of about 120 feet. The sonar images showed patterns that looked like walls, rectangular formations, organized layouts suggesting urban planning. The team, working with India's National Institute of Ocean Technology, recovered artifacts from the site using dredging equipment, wood samples, pottery fragments, and other materials. Some of these artifacts were sent for carbon dating. The results showed ages ranging from 8,000 to 9,500 years old. If accurate, these dates would make the site older than the established cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, older than Mesopotamian cities. Among the oldest urban settlements ever discovered, the findings were announced with great excitement. India's Minister of Science and Technology held a press conference. Media coverage was extensive. But then, the skepticism rolled in. Critics pointed out that carbon dating of artifacts recovered through dredging is problematic. The artifacts could have washed to the site from elsewhere. The sonar images were ambiguous, possibly showing natural geological features rather than artificial structures. And the depth of 120 feet meant the site would have been submerged around 9,000 years ago, which seemed impossibly early for urban civilization. Follow-up investigations were limited. The site is in territorial waters, access is controlled, and funding for further research was not forthcoming, so the Gulf of Cambay structures remain controversial, unverified, and largely forgotten by mainstream archaeology. Then there's the Bimini Road, discovered in 1968 off the coast of Bimini Island in the Bahamas. The formation consists of limestone blocks arranged in what looks like a road or wall, extending for about half a mile along the ocean floor in shallow water. The blocks are large, some weighing several tons, and they're arranged in a relatively straight line with rounded stones forming what appears to be a border. When it was first discovered, some researchers argued it was an artificial structure, possibly a harbor or road from an ancient civilization. The formation is in shallow water, but it would have been above sea level during the Ice Age, when water levels were lower. Carbon dating of the limestone suggested ages of around 4,000 years, but this is disputed because limestone is difficult to date accurately. Geologists studied the formation and most concluded it's natural. The limestone in the region naturally fractures in regular patterns. What looks like place blocks could be sections of a limestone layer that broke along natural fracture lines and settled into their current positions. Beach rock formations in the region create similar patterns. But some features are harder to explain naturally. The regularity of the arrangement, the fact that some blocks appear to be stacked, the presence of what looks like anchor stones or mooring holes in some blocks. The debate continues, but mainstream archaeology treats Bimini Road as a closed case. Natural formation, nothing to see here, move along. The pattern is consistent, underwater structures are found. They have features that look artificial or at least unusual. Dating suggests they are older than established civilization. Mainstream researchers propose natural explanations. The structures are ignored or dismissed. Further investigation is minimal. Why does this keep happening? Part of it is a legitimate skepticism. Nature can create remarkably regular formations. Basalt columns form perfect hexagonal pillars through natural cooling. Limestone fractures in straight lines. Erosion can create flat surfaces and right angles under the right conditions. Seeing artificiality in natural formations is a known cognitive bias. We're pattern recognition machines. We see faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, order in randomness, so skepticism is warranted. But skepticism should lead to investigation, not dismissal. If there is a possibility that the structure is artificial, the scientific approach should be to investigate thoroughly, to gather more data, to bring in experts from multiple disciplines. Instead, what happens is a natural explanation is proposed, the possibility of artificiality is dismissed, and the structure is forgotten. This happens because investigating these sites seriously would require accepting the possibility that they might be artificial, which would require accepting the possibility that they might be very old, which would require accepting the possibility that advanced cultures existed before the established timeline, which would require questioning the entire framework of human prehistory. It's easier to say it's natural and move on, but the ocean floor is vast and we've barely looked. The continental shelves where ice age coastlines existed cover millions of square miles. We have sonar maps of some areas, but high-resolution surveys that could detect ruins are rare and expensive. Actual underwater archaeological investigation of these areas is almost non-existent. Think about what we've found on land using new technology. LiDAR revealed 60,000 previously unknown Maya structures hidden under jungle canopy. Ground-penetrating radar has found buried structures at known archaeological sites that weren't visible from the surface. Satellite imagery identifies ancient roads, farms, and settlements from the patterns they leave in soil and vegetation. Every new technology reveals things we missed. What would we find if we applied the same level of technological survey to the submerged continental shelves? If we map the ocean floor in the same detail we've mapped the land, if we specifically looked for geometric patterns, regular structures, anomalies that might indicate artificial construction, we don't know because we haven't looked. The cost is cited as the main barrier. Deep water archaeology is expensive. Remotely operated vehicles, specialized sonar, ship time, expert personnel, all of it requires funding that's difficult to secure. But is it really about costs? We fund archaeological expeditions to excavate sites on land all the time. Universities, governments, private foundations, they all support conventional archaeology. The money exists. What doesn't exist is the institutional will to search for something that's not supposed to be there. If a researcher proposes an expedition to excavate a Bronze Age site, funding is available because Bronze Age sites are expected, understood, and fit within the established framework. If a researcher proposes an expedition to search for Ice Age cities on the continental shelf, the proposal gets rejected because Ice Age cities aren't supposed to exist and funding bodies don't want to waste resources on fringe theories. This is the fundamental problem. The hypothesis can't be tested if no one is allowed to look for evidence. And without evidence, the hypothesis continues to be dismissed. It's a perfect catch-22. 2022. But the absence of evidence from the ocean floor is not evidence that nothing is there. It's evidence that we haven't looked. And given that millions of square miles of formerly habitable Ice Age coastline are now underwater, unexplored, and largely unmapped, claiming with certainty that no advanced Ice Age civilization existed is premature at best, intellectually dishonest at worst. Hancock makes this point repeatedly. He's not claiming to have proof of a lost civilization. He's claiming that we haven't looked in the places where evidence would be if it existed. He's claiming that dismissing the hypothesis without investigation is unscientific, and he's claiming that the academic gatekeeping prevents the very research that could confirm or refute his ideas. The underwater evidence, or lack thereof, is central to the entire debate. If Ice Age civilization existed, its greatest achievements would be underwater. If we haven't seriously explored the underwater sites, we can't claim the evidence doesn't exist. We can only claim we haven't found it yet. And maybe if we actually looked, we'd find something that would change everything we think we know about human history. But there's another layer to this. Even if we find underwater structures, even if we find artifacts, even if we find evidence of sophisticated Ice Age cultures, there's still the question of what that evidence means. Does it prove advanced civilization comparable to modern society? Or does it just prove that Ice Age humans were more sophisticated than we've given them credit for? And this is where the debate gets philosophical. What would actually constitute proof of an advanced Ice Age civilization? This is the question that separates serious researchers from sensationalists, and it's a question that's harder to answer than you might think. When Hancock and others talk about a lost advanced civilization, what exactly do they mean by advanced? This is where the debate often breaks down into confusion and talking past each other. Critics of the hypothesis often interpret advanced to mean something like modern industrial civilization, electricity, computers, factories, cars, airplanes, and they rightfully point out that there's zero evidence for anything like that existing 12,000 years ago. If Ice Age people had industrial technology, we'd find traces, plastics in the geological record, synthetic materials, evidence of mining and refining on industrial scales, pollution markers. None of that exists, but Hancock isn't claiming Ice Age people had factories and computers. He's claiming they had sophisticated knowledge, monumental architecture, ocean-going ships, astronomical understanding, advanced mathematics, and organized societies capable of large-scale construction projects. Advanced relative to hunter-gatherers, not advanced relative to 21st century civilization. Think about ancient Egypt at its height. They built the pyramids, created sophisticated art, developed hieroglyphic writing, understood astronomy well enough to align their monuments to celestial events, practiced advanced medicine, including surgery, created complex irrigation systems, and organized labor forces numbering in the thousands. By any reasonable definition, ancient Egypt was an advanced civilization, but they didn't have electricity. They didn't have engines. They didn't have industrial technology. Does that make them not advanced? Of course not. So when we ask what evidence would prove an advanced Ice Age civilization existed, we need to be specific about what we're looking for. We're looking for evidence of organization, planning, and knowledge that exceeds what we expect from small bands of hunter-gatherers, evidence of monumental construction, evidence of long-distance trade networks, evidence of sophisticated astronomical or mathematical knowledge, evidence of writing or symbolic systems, evidence of specialized labor and social hierarchy. Some of this evidence exists, but it's disputed or explained away. Göbekli Tepe shows monumental construction and organization 11,600 years ago, but mainstream archaeology has accommodated this by revising the timeline and acknowledging that late Stone Age hunter-gatherers were more sophisticated than previously thought. The site is impressive, but it doesn't prove a civilization existed before it. It just proves that one existed at that time. The astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient monuments is harder to explain. Precession of the equinoxes takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. To discover this phenomenon, you need continuous astronomical observation over many centuries, probably thousands of years, with records being kept and passed down through generations. How do hunter-gatherer societies maintain that kind of observational continuity? They don't have permanent settlements, don't have writing, don't have institutions that persist for millennia, yet the knowledge appears not just in one culture, but in multiple ancient civilizations that supposedly developed independently. Ancient Egyptians knew about precession. Ancient Indians knew about it. Ancient Cambodians encoded it in Angkor Wat. The ancient Maya tracked it. How? The conventional answer is that each culture figured it out independently through long-term observation. Maybe, but that requires assuming that each culture maintained astronomical records for thousands of years, which requires assuming a level of continuity and record keeping that we have no evidence for in the archaeological record. The alternative explanation is that the knowledge was inherited from an earlier source, a culture that had already figured out precession through long-term observation, and that knowledge was passed down, preserved in oral traditions or symbolic systems, and eventually encoded in the monuments built by later civilizations. This is what Hancock means by a legacy, not that the lost civilization directly built the pyramids or Angkor Wat, but that they provided the astronomical knowledge that influenced the design of those monuments. But proving this requires proving that the knowledge existed before the monuments, and that's difficult when we have no written records from Ice Age cultures. So we're left with circumstantial evidence, astronomical knowledge that appears suddenly in the archaeological record without clear developmental stages, mathematical constants encoded in ancient architecture without clear evidence of how those constants were discovered, precision engineering that seems to exceed the capabilities of the tools supposedly available. None of it is definitive proof, all of it can be explained alternatively, but taken together it forms a pattern that's at least worth investigating. Then there are the myths, every culture has them, stories of a time before, of ancestors who knew more, of golden ages that ended in catastrophe, of floods and fires that destroyed the world, of survivors who taught the remnants of humanity how to rebuild. Mainstream archaeology treats mythology as fiction, interesting for understanding ancient cultures' beliefs and values, but not as historical records. And that's reasonable to a point. Myths are full of supernatural elements, gods and monsters, magic and miracles. You can't take them literally. But what if myths are distorted memories of real events, exaggerated and mythologized over thousands of years of oral transmission, but still containing kernels of truth? We know this happens. The discovery of Troy proved that Homer's Iliad, long dismissed as pure fiction, was based on a real city and possibly real events. The flood myths across 200 plus cultures all describe essentially the same event, a world-ending deluge that destroyed a previous age of humanity. For 150 years, scholars said these were just local flood memories, each culture independently creating similar stories based on experiencing river floods or tsunamis. But the details are too consistent. The timing in many myths corresponds roughly to the end of the last ice age when sea levels rose dramatically. The descriptions often include fire from the sky, which matches the comet impact hypothesis. The stories describe survivors who preserved knowledge and taught others. In Sumerian texts, they are called the Apkallu, the seven sages who came before the flood and taught humanity the arts of civilization. In Egyptian tradition, Thoth is the god of wisdom, who survived a cataclysm and preserved sacred knowledge. In Hindu tradition, the Saptarishi, seven sages, preserved the Vedas through cycles of destruction and recreation. In South American traditions, Viracocha appeared after floods and destruction to teach people agriculture, architecture, and astronomy before departing. In Mesoamerican tradition, Quetzalcoatl played the same role. All of these figures are described as coming from somewhere else, bringing knowledge, teaching, and then leaving or dying. They are described as different from the people they taught, often as bearded or light skinned in regions where the indigenous people were not. Now, the conventional interpretation is that these are all mythological figures, gods or culture heroes invented to explain the origins of civilization. The knowledge didn't come from historical people, it came from within each culture as they developed agriculture and technology. But what if these myths preserve memories of real people? Not gods, not aliens, just humans who survived a catastrophe and possess knowledge from before the fall. They would have seemed like gods to the scattered survivors they encountered. They would have had knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, architecture, things that the traumatized survivors had lost or never knew. And as the stories were passed down over hundreds of generations, the real people would have been elevated to divine status, their achievements exaggerated, their teachings mythologized, but the core memory remaining. A memory that knowledge came from before, from a time that ended in catastrophe. This interpretation is speculative. You can't prove myths are based on real events without corroborating evidence. But you also can't prove they're entirely fictional. The stories exist. They're remarkably consistent across cultures that supposedly had no contact. And they all point to the same thing. Something came before, something was lost. Survivors preserve fragments and pass them down. Combine the myths with the physical anomalies, the astronomical knowledge, the precision engineering, the underwater possibilities, and you have what lawyers would call a circumstantial case. No single piece of evidence proves the hypothesis, but the accumulation of anomalies, each one individually explainable, but collectively forming a pattern, creates reasonable doubt about the established timeline. Is that enough to prove an advanced Ice Age civilization existed? No, but it's enough to justify serious investigation, and that's all Hancock and researchers like him are really asking for, not acceptance of the hypothesis as fact, but acknowledgement that it's a legitimate question worth investigating. The problem is that investigation requires funding, institutional support, and career researchers willing to risk their professional reputations on a controversial hypothesis. And the academic structure makes that nearly impossible. Young researchers can't touch these topics without jeopardizing their careers. Established researchers who investigate these questions get marginalized and dismissed. Funding goes to conventional archaeology, not speculative searches for hypothetical lost civilizations. So the investigation doesn't happen, and the absence of evidence is used to dismiss the hypothesis, which prevents investigation, which maintains the absence of evidence. The cycle continues, but there's a deeper issue here that goes beyond archaeology. What Hancock's hypothesis really challenges is our assumption about progress and human history. We like to think of history as a linear progression from primitive to advanced, Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age to Industrial Age to Information Age. Each step building on the previous one, each generation smarter and more capable than the last. This narrative is comforting. It means we're at the pinnacle of human achievement. It means progress is inevitable. It means we're safe in our sophistication. The idea that an advanced civilization could fall so completely that future generations wouldn't even know it existed is terrifying. It means our own civilization is fragile. It means all our knowledge, all our technology, all our achievements could disappear. It means we're not the first, We're just the latest. And maybe not even the most advanced. Yeah, this psychological resistance is part of why the hypothesis faces such opposition. It's not just about the evidence or lack thereof, it's about what accepting the hypothesis would mean for our self image as a civilization. But psychological resistance doesn't change reality, and the reality is that civilizations do fall. We have historical examples. The Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw advanced civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East collapse within a few decades. Writing systems were lost, trade networks disintegrated, cities were abandoned. It took centuries to recover. The Western Roman Empire fell, and Europe entered the Dark Ages. Technology was lost, literacy declined, the recipe for Roman concrete was forgotten and not rediscovered until modern times. The classic Maya collapsed around 900 CE. Their cities were abandoned and swallowed by jungle. The complex hieroglyphic writing system was forgotten. When the Spanish arrived 600 years later, the descendants of the Maya couldn't read the inscriptions their ancestors had carved. These are civilizations that fell within recorded history within the last few thousand years, and they still lost knowledge and technology. The Bronze Age peoples had writing, so we know they existed even though their civilizations collapsed. The Romans left massive stone structures that survived their fall. The Maya left pyramids and cities, but imagine if those civilizations had fallen 10,000 years earlier. Imagine if their cities had been on coastlines that are now underwater. Imagine if their written records had been on materials that decay, papyrus and parchment and wood. Imagine if the climate had shifted dramatically, if sea levels had risen 400 feet, if their territories had been submerged or buried. How much evidence would remain? Would we even know they existed? This is the thought experiment at the heart of Hancock's hypothesis. If our civilization fell today, what would remain after 12,000 years? Our cities are mostly steel, glass, and concrete. Steel rusts, just glass breaks down, concrete crumbles. In a few thousand years, most modern buildings would be rubble. In 12,000 years, they'd be unrecognizable or completely eroded. Our knowledge is increasingly digital. If the power grid fails permanently, if the internet goes down, if all our electronic devices stop working, how much of our accumulated knowledge survives? Some books would remain, but paper decays in centuries, not millennia. The physical infrastructure of our information age would corrode and collapse. Future archaeologists would find strange materials, plastics, and alloys that don't occur naturally. They'd find traces of pollution, nuclear isotopes from our bombs and power plants. They'd find synthetic chemicals, but would they find evidence of cities and civilization? Maybe if they looked in the right places and knew what to look for. But if sea levels rose and our coastal cities were submerged, if climate change or catastrophe forced survivors to abandon the coast, if 12,000 years of erosion and sedimentation covered everything, the evidence would be fragmentary at best. And if those future archaeologists had a firmly established timeline that said advanced civilization only began 6,000 years ago, and if finding evidence of our civilization would contradict that timeline and threaten careers and institutional frameworks, how hard would they look? This is the mirror Hancock holds up to modern archaeology. We assume we'd find evidence of Ice Age civilization if it existed. But would we? Are we looking in the right places? Are we willing to challenge our assumptions? Or are we so invested in the current timeline that we're blind to evidence that contradicts it? These are uncomfortable questions. They should be. Science progresses by questioning assumptions, by being willing to revise theories when new evidence appears, by investigating anomalies rather than explaining them away. The strongest argument against Hancock's hypothesis is the absence of definitive evidence. No cities have been found, no writing, no artifacts that unambiguously demonstrate advanced Ice Age civilization. The archaeological record doesn't show it, but the strongest argument for Hancock's hypothesis is that we haven't seriously looked in the places where evidence would be. The millions of square miles of submerged continental shelf remain largely unexplored. The deep surveying and underwater archaeology needed to find or rule out submerged ruins hasn't been done. And the institutional resistance to even considering the hypothesis prevents the investigation that could resolve the question. So we're left in limbo. A hypothesis that can't be proven without investigation that won't be funded because the hypothesis isn't proven. Meanwhile, the anomalies accumulate. Göbekli Tepe keeps getting older, now dated to possibly 12,000 years. New megalithic sites keep being discovered. Karahan Tepe, Boncuklu Tarla, multiple sites in Turkey featuring sophisticated construction from the same period. Each one pushes the timeline of complex human society earlier. LIDAR keeps revealing hidden structures. Satellite archaeology keeps finding unknown sites. DNA analysis keeps revealing unexpected human migrations and interactions. Every technological advance in archaeology reveals that the past was more complex than we thought. At some point, the accumulation of anomalies requires a paradigm shift. At some point, revising the timeline piecemeal isn't enough. At some point, we have to consider that maybe the framework itself is wrong. Maybe civilization is older than we think. Maybe advanced cultures rose and fell before the ones we know about. Maybe the myths are trying to tell us something we've been too arrogant to hear. That we're not the first, that others came before, that they fell, and that we could fall too. The genetic evidence tells a story that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. Human DNA contains mysteries that don't fit neatly into the comfortable narrative of steady population growth and gradual cultural development. There are bottlenecks and sudden population crashes where humanity was reduced to a fraction of its previous numbers. There are ghost populations, groups of ancient humans that appear in our DNA but left no archaeological trace. And there are migration patterns that suggest contact and movement we can't fully explain. The most dramatic bottleneck occurred around 70,000 years ago. Genetic analysis of human populations shows that at some point in our past, the entire human species was reduced to perhaps 10,000 individuals, maybe fewer. Some estimates put it as low as 2,000 breeding pairs. This is called the Toba catastrophe theory, named after a supervolcano in Indonesia that erupted approximately 74,000 years ago. The eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in the last 2 million years. It ejected 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. For comparison, Mount St. Helens in 1980 ejected 1 cubic kilometer. Toba was nearly 3,000 times larger. The eruption would have caused a volcanic winter, ash in the atmosphere, blocking sunlight, global temperatures dropping by several degrees, growing seasons disrupted, ecosystems collapsing. The impact on human populations would have been catastrophic. Most humans died. The survivors were scattered in small pockets, isolated from each other, struggling to survive in a world gone cold and dark. This is not speculation. This happened. The genetic evidence is clear. At some point around 70,000 years ago, human genetic diversity crashed. We went through what geneticists call a population bottleneck, a dramatic reduction in numbers that left its signature in our DNA. Every human alive today descends from the small group that survived, so we have proof that catastrophic events can nearly wipe out humanity. We have proof that advanced, intelligent humans, people with our brains and our capabilities, can be reduced to tiny, struggling populations by environmental disaster. We have proof that reset events are real. The Toba catastrophe happened 70,000 years ago, long before the Ice Age civilization Hancock proposes. But it establishes the principle: catastrophe can erase populations. Survivors can carry forward knowledge and genes, but the culture and civilization they came from can be lost. The archaeological record from 70,000 years ago is sparse. We have some stone tools, some evidence of human presence, but we don't know much about the societies that existed before Toba. We don't know what was lost. We only know that humanity survived and eventually thrived again. Now consider the Younger Dryas event 12,800 years ago. Not as globally catastrophic as Toba, but still a massive shock to the climate system. Widespread extinctions, rapid environmental change, comet impacts triggering fires and floods. If this event caused a population bottleneck in humans, we might not be able to detect it. Genetically, the bottleneck would be much smaller than Toba, more recent, and potentially masked by subsequent population growth. But the impact on human societies would have been severe. Any coastal populations would have been displaced by sea level rise. Any cultures dependent on megafauna hunting would have collapsed when the animals went extinct. Any agricultural communities in the affected regions would have faced crop failures and famine. Not everyone would have died, but many would have. And organized societies, the complex cultures that require stability and resources to maintain, would have been particularly vulnerable. You can survive as a small hunter-gatherer band with minimal resources. You can't maintain a city, you can't maintain trade networks, you can't maintain specialized crafts and knowledge systems. When civilization collapses, the survivors revert to simpler survival strategies, and this is where the genetic evidence gets interesting in ways that support Hancock's ideas. Modern genetic studies have revealed that ancient human populations were far more mobile and interconnected than previously believed. We used to think that early humans migrated out of Africa, spread across the world, and then stayed relatively isolated in their respective regions, developing into distinct populations. The genetic reality is much more complex. Ancient humans were moving around constantly, mixing, separating, mixing again. Trade networks covered vast distances, genes flowed across continents, and there are hints of populations we can't fully identify. Ghost lineages that appear in our DNA but left no clear archaeological record. One example is the Denisovans. We only know they existed because of genetic evidence. A finger bone found in a cave in Siberia yielded DNA that didn't match Neanderthals or modern humans. It was something else, a distinct human population that interbred with our ancestors. Denisovan genes appear in modern populations across Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. These people existed, they were widespread, they contributed to our gene pool, but we have almost no archaeological evidence of their culture, a few bone fragments and teeth. That's it. If we didn't have DNA analysis, we wouldn't know they existed at all. This proves that human populations can be genetically significant, widespread, and influential, yet leave almost no archaeological trace. The absence of archaeological evidence doesn't mean they didn't exist. It means their remains and artifacts didn't survive or haven't been found. Now apply this principle to Ice Age civilizations. If a sophisticated culture existed 15,000 years ago, built primarily with wood and organic materials, lived on coastlines now submerged, and was largely destroyed by catastrophe, what would remain? Maybe nothing we've found yet. Maybe scattered artifacts that we've misinterpreted or dismissed. Maybe genetic signatures that we haven't properly analyzed. Recent studies of ancient DNA from prehistoric humans show unexpected levels of genetic diversity and structure. There were distinct populations that don't fit neatly into our models of human migration and settlement. Some of these populations disappeared, absorbed into other groups, or dying out. The genetic map of prehistoric humanity is much more complicated than the clean branching tree we used to imagine. It's more like a braided stream, populations splitting and merging, genes flowing in unexpected directions, cultures meeting and mixing in ways we don't fully understand. And within this complex genetic landscape, there's room for sophisticated cultures that rose and fell without leaving obvious archaeological remains. There's another piece of genetic evidence that's puzzling. The domestication of dogs occurred much earlier than it should have according to conventional models. Genetic studies suggest dogs diverged from wolves anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 years ago. This means humans were selectively breeding wolves into dogs during the Ice Age, long before the agricultural revolution that supposedly marked the beginning of settled civilization. Domestication requires sustained human populations in one area stable enough to maintain breeding programs over many generations. It requires surplus food to feed animals that aren't yet useful. It requires foresight and planning, seeing the potential in wolves as companions and helpers rather than just competitors for food. Hunter-gatherers supposedly didn't have this kind of stability and foresight. They were nomadic, following food sources, living hand to mouth, yet somehow they domesticated wolves into dogs tens of thousands of years ago. The same puzzle exists for other domesticated species. Genetic evidence suggests that many of the plants we consider domesticated actually have much older relationships with humans than the archaeological record shows. Humans were managing plant populations, selectively harvesting, possibly even deliberately planting, long before what we call the agricultural revolution. This suggests that the line between hunter-gatherers and agricultural societies is much blurrier than we've assumed. It suggests that humans were manipulating their environment and practicing proto-agriculture much earlier than the timeline indicates. And if humans were sophisticated enough to domesticate dogs 30,000 years ago, sophisticated enough to manage plant populations, sophisticated enough to create the art in Chauvet Cave 36,000 years ago, what else were they capable of? The conventional answer is not much else. They had these capabilities but didn't develop complex societies. They remained in small nomadic bands until the agricultural revolution. But is that really likely? You have humans with modern brains, modern intelligence, demonstrating sophisticated planning and skill for tens of thousands of years, and they don't develop complex societies until suddenly around 10,000 BCE, civilization explodes into existence independently in multiple locations. The genetic evidence also reveals another mystery. Mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only through the maternal line, shows that all modern humans descend from a relatively small population of women who lived in Africa around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. This is separate from the Yoba bottleneck. This is the origin of our species, the mitochondrial Eve population. But here's this the strange part. The genetic diversity in modern humans is remarkably low compared to other large mammal species. We are incredibly genetically similar to each other despite being spread across the entire planet. This low diversity suggests that humanity has gone through multiple bottlenecks, multiple population crashes that reduced our numbers and our genetic variety, not just Toba. Multiple events where humanity was reduced to small populations that then expanded again. Each bottleneck would have been a near extinction event. Each one would have destroyed cultures and knowledge. Each one would have forced survivors to start over with only fragments of what came before. And we don't know when all these bottlenecks occurred. We can detect Toba because it was so recent and so severe. But earlier events, smaller crashes, would be harder to detect in the genetic record, especially if they happened more than 100,000 years ago. The pattern is clear. Humanity has experienced multiple catastrophes. We've been knocked back repeatedly. Each time we survived and rebuilt, but what was lost in those events? What knowledge and achievements disappeared with the populations that died? We'll never know what was lost 200,000 years ago or 150,000 years ago too much time has passed, the archaeological record is too sparse. But the Younger Dryas event is recent enough that we should be able to find evidence if we look in the right places. And the fact that we find anomalies, that we find myths, that we find unexplained knowledge suggests that maybe something was lost in that event too. Something more than just scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. There is also the question of language. Linguistic studies suggest that human language is much older than civilization. We've been speaking complex languages for at least 50,000 years, possibly longer. Language requires abstract thinking, symbolic representation, grammar, and syntax. It's a sophisticated technology that only humans have fully developed, and with language comes the ability to pass down knowledge across generations. Oral traditions can preserve information for thousands of years. Aboriginal Australians have oral histories that describe coastlines and landmarks from over 10,000 years ago, before sea level rise changed the geography. These stories have been verified by comparing them to geological evidence. The oral traditions are accurate. They really do describe the world as it was during the Ice Age. If Aboriginal cultures can preserve accurate information for 10,000 plus years through oral tradition, what else might be preserved in the myths and legends of other cultures? Stories of catastrophe and destruction, stories of advanced ancestors, stories of knowledge from the before time. We dismiss these stories as mythology because they contain supernatural elements. But what if the supernatural elements were added later, embellishments and misunderstandings, while the core events being described were real? The genetic evidence, the linguistic evidence, the archaeological anomalies, the myths, they all point in the same direction. Humanity is older, more complex, more sophisticated, and more resilient than the simple timeline suggests. We've risen and fallen multiple times. We've experienced catastrophes that nearly wiped us out. We've lost knowledge and had to rebuild. And the most recent major catastrophe, the Younger Dryas event, occurred at exactly the time when myths say an advanced age ended in destruction. Coincidence or memory? The scientific method requires that we follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it contradicts our assumptions. The evidence suggests that human prehistory is more complex than we've believed. It suggests that sophisticated cultures may have existed before the established timeline. It suggests that catastrophes can erase civilizations so completely that only myths and anomalies remain. None of this proves Hancock's specific hypothesis that a globe-spanning advanced civilization existed during the Ice Age. But it proves that the possibility exists. It proves that the absence of archaeological evidence is not definitive. It proves that humans were capable of far more, far earlier than we've given them credit for. And it proves that catastrophic reset events are real, documented in our genes, preserved in our myths, and visible in the geological record. The question isn't whether catastrophic reset can happen. They can, and they have. The question is what was lost when they happened, and whether we're willing to seriously investigate that question, even if the answers challenge everything we've been taught about human history. The myths are screaming at us, but we refuse to listen. Every ancient culture has stories about the world before, about ancestors who possessed great knowledge, about catastrophes that destroyed previous ages, about survivors who preserved wisdom and passed it down. We've categorized these stories as mythology, filed them away as interesting cultural artifacts with no historical value, dismissed them as primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena through supernatural narratives. But what if we've been wrong? What if these stories are exactly what they claim to be? Memories of real events, distorted by time and oral transmission, but fundamentally true. Let's start with the flood myths because they are the most widespread and the most consistent. Over 200 cultures around the world have flood myths. That's not an exaggeration. Anthropologists have documented flood stories from North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, and Pacific Islands. Cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, all tell versions of the same story. There was a great flood. It covered the earth. Almost everyone died. A few survivors escaped, usually in a boat or by climbing to high ground. After the flood, the survivors repopulated the world. The details vary, but the core narrative is identical. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE but based on older sources, tells the story of Utnapishtim, who survived the flood sent by the gods by building a boat and filling it with animals and seeds. Sound familiar? The biblical story of Noah comes directly from this older Mesopotamian tradition, but the Mesopotamian story itself comes from even older Sumerian sources. The flood narrative in Mesopotamia predates the Bible by over 1,000 years. The Hindu Puranas describe multiple cycles of creation and destruction. In one story, the god Vishnu appears to a man named Manu as a fish and warns him that a great flood is coming. Manu builds a boat, the flood destroys the world, and Manu becomes the ancestor of all future humans. In ancient Greek mythology, Zeus decides to destroy humanity with a flood. Only Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha survive by building a chest and floating on the waters until the flood recedes. They then repopulate the earth by throwing stones behind them, which transform into humans. In Chinese tradition, the Great Flood is a central event in early history. The Emperor Gan and later his son Yu battle against the flood waters for generations, eventually controlling them through engineering and creating the foundations of Chinese civilization. Native American tribes across North America have flood stories. The Ojibwe tell of a time when the world was covered with water and only a few survived on a raft. The Hopi describe multiple worlds destroyed by floods and fires. The Lakota remember a time when waters covered everything and only a few people escaped to the tops of the highest mountains. In South America, tribes throughout the Amazon basin and the Andes have flood myths. The Inca told the Spanish conquistadors about Viracocha, who appeared after a great flood that destroyed the previous world. He emerged from Lake Titicaca and began teaching the survivors the arts of civilization. Australian Aboriginal stories describe a time when the sea level rose and covered the land. Specific stories describe locations and landmarks that are now underwater, which geological surveys have confirmed actually existed before sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Pacific Islander cultures, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Micronesia, have flood myths describing the ocean rising and consuming the land. For over a century, scholars explain these consistent stories as coincidence. Every culture experiences floods. Rivers overflow, tsunamis strike, coast storms bring torrential rain. It's natural that cultures would create stories about flooding, and maybe some cultures borrowed the story from others through trade and contact, spreading the myth around the world. But this explanation has problems. First, the consistency is too specific. These are not just stories about local floods, they are stories about world-ending catastrophes that destroyed a previous age of humanity. They describe water covering mountains, not just valleys. They describe almost total extinction of human populations, not just local disasters. Second, many of these stories include details that match the Younger Dryas event and the subsequent sea level rise. The timing in some traditions places the flood at roughly the right period. The descriptions often include not just water but fire, which matches the comet impact hypothesis that triggered the Younger Dryas with airbursts and continent-wide fires. Third, the stories consistently describe a before time, an age before the flood when things were different. Sometimes this previous age is described as a golden age, when humans lived longer, were more powerful, or possessed greater knowledge. The flood ends this golden age and forces humanity to start over. These aren't just disaster stories, they're stories about the loss of civilization and the need to rebuild. Let's look at specific examples that include details too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Plato's account of Atlantis comes from his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. Plato claims he is recounting a story that the Athenian statesman Solon heard from Egyptian priests during a visit to Egypt around 600 BCE. The Egyptian priest tells Solon that the Greeks are like children because they have no memory of ancient events. The priests say there have been many destructions of humanity by fire and by water, and that the Egyptian priesthood has preserved records of these events while other cultures forgot. They then describe Atlantis, an advanced island civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's visit. Do the math, 9,000 years before 600 BCE puts Atlantis around 9,600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. That's exactly the Younger Dryas period. That's exactly when Göbekli Tepe was built. The Egyptian priests describe Atlantis as a naval power with sophisticated technology, monumental architecture, and extensive trade networks. They say Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophe, sinking beneath the ocean. For 2,000 years, scholars have debated whether Atlantis was real or fictional. Most modern academics treat it as Plato's invention, a philosophical allegory not meant to be taken literally. But Plato insists multiple times in the dialogues that the story is true, not fiction. He goes out of his way to emphasize that Solon heard this from Egyptian priests, that the account comes from preserved records, that it's not mythology but history. Why would Plato, a serious philosopher, insist so strongly that a fictional story is true? The easier explanation is that he believed it was true. He was recounting a story that was already ancient in his time, a story preserved by Egyptian priests who claimed to maintain records going back thousands of years. And the dating the priests gave puts the destruction of Atlantis at exactly the period when we know a global catastrophe occurred, exactly when sea levels began rising dramatically, exactly when coastlines around the world were submerged. Hancock's controversial suggestion is that Atlantis might not have been a specific place, but rather a memory of the entire Ice Age coastal civilization that was destroyed by the Younger Dryas event and subsequent sea level rise. Multiple advanced settlements around the world, all destroyed by the same catastrophe, all remembered in myths, all conflated in later retellings into one story about one island civilization. It's speculative, but it fits the evidence better than dismissing Atlantis as pure fiction, while simultaneously trying to explain why hundreds of cultures have similar stories about lost civilizations destroyed by floods. The Hindu texts go even further. The Puranas describe cycles of creation and destruction spanning millions of years. Each cycle, called a yuga, lasts thousands or millions of years and ends in catastrophe. The current age, the Kali Yuga, is described as a degraded age where human knowledge and lifespans are reduced compared to previous golden ages. The previous age, the Dvapara Yuga, was more advanced. The age before that, the Treta Yuga, even more so. And the first age, the Satya Yuga or Krita Yuga, was a golden age when humans lived for thousands of years and possessed divine knowledge. Western scholars have always dismissed these vast timescales as mythological exaggeration. Humans don't live for thousands of years. Civilizations haven't existed for millions of years. It's clearly not literal history, but what if the core concept is accurate, even if the specific numbers are inflated? What if the Hindu texts preserve a memory that humanity has gone through multiple cycles of advancement and destruction, that we've risen before, fallen before, risen again? The geological and genetic evidence supports this. We know humanity has experienced multiple catastrophes. We know civilizations have collapsed repeatedly, even in recorded history. The idea of cyclical rise and fall isn't crazy, it's documented. Maybe the Hindu texts are preserving this understanding in mythological form, and the specific dating is confused, but the essential truth remains: humanity rises and falls. Knowledge is gained and lost. We're not in the first age of civilization, we're in the latest. In Egypt, the god Thoth is described as the preserver of knowledge. According to Egyptian mythology, Thoth existed before the current age of humanity. He survived a cataclysm and brought knowledge to the Egyptians, teaching them writing, mathematics, astronomy, and architecture. Thoth is often depicted with a human body and the head of an ibis, marking him as different from regular humans. He's associated with the moon, with wisdom, with sacred knowledge. Egyptian priests told Greek visitors like Herodotus and Plato that their records went back tens of thousands of years, preserved by a succession of priests who maintained the knowledge through multiple catastrophes. The Greeks were impressed and a bit intimidated by these claims. They recognized that Greek civilization was young compared to Egypt, and that the Egyptians possessed knowledge that seemed impossibly ancient. Modern archaeology dates the beginning of Egyptian civilization to around 3100 BCE, with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. But the Egyptians themselves claimed their culture was far older. They had king lists that extended back into pre-dynastic times, into what they called the time of the gods, when divine beings ruled Egypt before human pharaohs. Mainstream Egyptology treats these pre-dynastic king lists as mythology. Obviously, gods didn't literally rule Egypt. Obviously, the timeline is inflated. But what if the lists preserve a memory of real rulers from before the dynastic period? What if Thoth represents a real tradition of knowledge preservation by a priesthood that predates the pharaohs? What if Egyptian civilization didn't begin in 3100 BCE, but was actually the rebuilding of something older that had been lost? The Sphinx adds weight to this possibility. Geologist Robert Schoch has argued for decades that the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure indicate water erosion, not wind erosion. The climate in Egypt has been arid for thousands of years. Wind and sand erosion create horizontal weathering patterns, but the Sphinx shows vertical erosion patterns consistent with heavy rainfall. The last time Egypt experienced rainfall heavy enough to create this type of erosion was at the end of the last ice age, before 10,000 years ago, during a period when North Africa was much wetter than today. If Schoch is right, and many geologists who have examined the site agree with his assessment of the weathering patterns, then the Sphinx is at least 9,000 years old, possibly older. It predates Egyptian dynastic civilization by thousands of years. It comes from the time the Egyptian priests told the Greeks about, from the age before the catastrophe. Mainstream Egyptology rejects Schoch's dating because it contradicts the established timeline. They argue the weathering must have another explanation, that Schoch is misinterpreting the geological evidence, that the Sphinx couldn't possibly be that old because civilization didn't exist yet. But Schoch is a geologist, not an archaeologist. He's reading the rocks, and the rocks say the weathering is from water, not wind. And if the Sphinx really is 9,000 or 10,000 years old, it means the Egyptians inherited it from an earlier culture. It means their claims about preserving ancient knowledge might be true. It means their mythology about Thoth and the gods who came before might be distorted memories of real people from a real earlier civilization. In South America, the story of Viracocha appears across multiple Andean cultures. Viracocha is described as appearing after a great flood and destruction. He's said to be tall, bearded, and light-skinned, different in appearance from the indigenous people. He travels throughout the Andes teaching people agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and weaving. He performs miracles, heals the sick, raises the dead. Then he departs, walking across the Pacific Ocean on the water, promising to return someday. The Spanish conquistadors heard this story from the Inca and from tribes throughout the Andes. Some accounts suggested the indigenous people initially thought the Spanish might be the return of Viracocha, which is why some leaders initially didn't resist the conquest as strongly as they might have. The story has clear mythological elements: walking on water, performing miracles. These are supernatural embellishments, but strip away the mythological additions, and you have a core narrative. After a catastrophe, a person or group of people with advanced knowledge appeared in South America and taught skills to the survivors. These teachers were remembered as gods because their knowledge seemed divine to the people they were teaching. They were described as looking different because they came from somewhere else, from a population that had different physical characteristics. Over thousands of years of retelling, the story became mythology. The teachers became gods, their knowledge became miracles. But the memory remained. Knowledge came from before, from survivors of something that was destroyed. In Mesoamerica, the same pattern appears with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god. Quetzalcoatl is described as bringing civilization to the people of Mexico. He teaches agriculture, calendar systems, astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. He's associated with the planet Venus, indicating astronomical knowledge. Like Viracocha, Quetzalcoatl is often described as bearded and light-skinned in some traditions, though this is disputed and may be a later addition. The Aztecs, Maya, and earlier Mesoamerican cultures all have versions of the Quetzalcoatl story. The deity appears in different forms across different time periods, but the association with knowledge and civilization building remains constant. Again, we have a mythological figure credited with bringing knowledge after a period of destruction and chaos. And again, we can ask whether the mythology preserves a memory of real events. The pattern is global: Sumerian Apkallu, Egyptian Thoth, Hindu Saptarishi, Greek Prometheus bringing fire and knowledge to humanity, Persian traditions of ancient kings who ruled for thousands of years before the flood, Chinese tales of divine emperors who taught civilization skills. All of these stories share common elements. There was a time before, that time ended in catastrophe. Survivors or divine beings brought knowledge to the remnants of humanity. Civilization rebuilt using this inherited wisdom. Modern anthropology explains these consistent narratives as cultural archetypes, universal human myths that emerge independently because they address common human concerns about origins, knowledge, and survival. Maybe, but that explanation requires assuming that hundreds of cultures independently created nearly identical stories by coincidence. The alternative explanation is simpler. The stories are similar because they describe the same events: a real catastrophe, real survivors, real transmission of knowledge. The mythological elements were added later as the stories were passed down orally over thousands of years, and the original events became legendary. Which explanation is more likely? That every culture invented the same myth independently, or that they're all remembering the same history? The myths have been dismissed for so long that we've forgotten they might be trying to tell us something important. They're screaming that something came before, that it was destroyed, that we had to start over, that knowledge was preserved and passed on. And the physical evidence, the anomalies, the underwater possibilities, the astronomical knowledge, all of it supports what the myths are saying. Maybe it's time we started listening. We need to talk about what this means for us right now, today, because this isn't just an academic debate about ancient history. This is about understanding our own fragility, our own place in the deep story of humanity, and the very real possibility that everything we've built could disappear just as completely as what came before. Let's start with the thought experiment. Imagine our civilization ended tomorrow. not gradually but catastrophically. A comet impact, a supervolcano, a cascade of nuclear exchanges, a pandemic that we can't stop, runaway climate change triggering feedback loops we can't reverse. Pick your apocalypse. They're all possible. They've all happened before in one form or another. The survivors and their would-be survivors would face immediate challenges: finding food and clean water, avoiding disease, staying warm or cool, basic survival. Within months, the fragile systems that support modern life would collapse completely. The electrical grid fails permanently without maintenance. The internet goes down, data centers lose power, and hard drives corrupt. Cell towers stop working. The vast digital repository of human knowledge, the servers and clouds and databases that store everything we know, becomes inaccessible and then degrades into nothing. Most people today can't grow their own food, can't purify water, can't make fire without matches or lighters, can't navigate without GPS, can't identify edible plants, can't hunt, can't preserve food without refrigeration, can't make clothing, can't build shelter beyond basic structures. We're completely dependent on systems that require constant maintenance, constant energy input, constant expertise. When those systems fail, most of the population dies. The survivors would be those with practical skills, those in the right locations, those who get lucky. They'd revert to hunter gatherer strategies because that's what works when civilization collapses. You can survive by hunting, gathering, fishing, moving with the seasons. You can't survive by trying to maintain a city. Within a generation, maybe two, the survivors' children would grow up in a world without electricity, without books they can read, without any connection to the technological civilization their grandparents knew. The knowledge would fade, stories would be passed down, garbled and mythologized. Before the catastrophe, people could talk to anyone in the world instantly. They could fly through the air in metal birds. They could see events happening on the other side of the planet. They had magic devices that held all the knowledge of humanity. These stories would sound like mythology to people living in a post-collapse world, gods and magic, not technology. The children's children would dismiss them as legends. Now add 12,000 years. Imagine 12,000 years passing. What physical evidence of our civilization would remain? Our cities are built with steel, concrete, and glass. Steel rusts completely in centuries. Concrete crumbles and breaks down. Glass shatters and erodes. The buildings would collapse, the materials would break down, and within a few thousand years, most structures would be unrecognizable rubble. Within 12,000 years, they'd be buried under sediment, overgrown by vegetation, eroded by wind and water. Mount Rushmore might last. Carved into granite, it could survive tens of thousands of years, though even granite erodes. Future archaeologists might find it and wonder what it meant. These giant faces carved into a mountain. They'd probably interpret it as religious art, gods, or ancestors. They'd have no context to understand it was presidential portraits. The Great Pyramids would survive, massive stone structures last. That's why ancient megalithic sites are what we find from prehistory. Stone endures. Everything else decays, but our civilization isn't built primarily of stone. It's built of materials that don't last. The plastics would persist for thousands of years, but would eventually break down into microplastics and then into constituent chemicals. Future geologists might find a layer of synthetic polymers in the sediment and wonder what natural process created them. Nuclear waste would remain radioactive, creating isotope anomalies in the geological record. But without context, without understanding what nuclear reactors were, future scientists might puzzle over these anomalies without recognizing them as evidence of an advanced civilization. Some things would survive as archaeological oddities. Stainless steel objects might last thousands of years. Aluminum, gold, and platinum don't corrode, so objects made from these materials could survive. But without context, a corroded stainless steel knife found in the sediment would just be a strange artifact. Ancient peoples somehow knew how to make this metal alloy, but we don't know how they did it with primitive technology. Sound familiar? Our knowledge is increasingly fragile. We've digitized everything: books, scientific papers, photographs, records. Everything is on servers and hard drives. When the power fails, all of that becomes inaccessible. Even if some data storage survive physically, without the hardware and software to read it, it's just plastic and metal. A hard drive from 2025 would be completely unreadable 1,000 years from now, even if it survived physically intact. We've built the most sophisticated civilization in human history, and we've stored all its knowledge in the most fragile form possible: electronic data that requires constant power and maintenance to remain accessible. We've become so dependent on just-in-time supply chains, on specialization, on technology, that we've lost the basic skills that kept humanity alive for 200,000 years. Most people in modern civilization couldn't survive a year without the systems that support them. And those systems are fragile. They depend on electricity, on fuel, on global trade, on social stability, on thousands of interconnected dependencies. Break a few key links, and the whole thing collapses. This is the mirror that Hancock's hypothesis holds up to modern civilization. We look at the past and say advanced civilization couldn't have existed 12,000 years ago because we would have found evidence. But if our civilization fell tomorrow, would future archaeologists 12,000 years from now find evidence of us? Maybe. If they looked in the right places, if they had the right technology, if they were willing to challenge their assumptions about what was possible in the past. But maybe not. Maybe they'd find some strange artifacts, some anomalies they couldn't explain, and they'd dismiss them as probably natural or probably just primitive peoples who got lucky. Maybe they'd have a comfortable timeline that said civilization began 6,000 years from now, and evidence of us wouldn't fit that timeline, so it would be explained away or ignored. We want to believe we're special, that we're the pinnacle of human achievement, that we're the first to reach this level of sophistication. But the geological record shows that Earth has experienced multiple catastrophic events. The genetic record shows that humanity has experienced multiple population bottlenecks. The archaeological record, as sparse as it is, shows that our ancestors were capable of far more than we've given them credit for. And the myths, consistent across hundreds of cultures, all say the same thing. This isn't the first time. Others came before, they fell, we're rebuilding. The Younger Dryas event happened. This is not speculation. 12,800 years ago, something triggered rapid climate change, continent-wide fires, megafauna extinction, and the disappearance of human cultures from the archaeological record. The evidence is in the geological layers, in the ice cores, in the sediment. Whether it was a comet impact or some other trigger, the catastrophe was real. Sea levels rose 400 feet over the following thousands of years, drowning coastlines around the world. This is not speculation. The drowned coastlines are mapped. We know exactly where the Ice Age shorelines were. We know that millions of square miles of formerly habitable land are now underwater. We know that if humans built cities on those coastlines, those cities are now under hundreds of feet of ocean water buried under sediment, and we haven't seriously looked for them. Ancient humans were far more sophisticated than we've assumed. This is not speculation. Göbekli Tepe exists. The precision stonework in Egypt and Peru exists. The Antikythera mechanism exists. The astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient monuments exists. The evidence keeps accumulating that Ice Age and early post-Ice Age humans were capable of sophisticated construction, complex organization, and advanced knowledge. And the myths all point to knowledge being inherited from an earlier source. This is not speculation. The myths exist, they are documented, they're consistent, they all describe the same pattern of catastrophe, survival, and knowledge transmission. We can choose to dismiss them as coincidental fiction, or we can consider that maybe they're preserving real memories. So, where does this leave us? The evidence isn't conclusive, there's no smoking gun, no undeniable proof of an advanced Ice Age civilization. But there's enough evidence to warrant serious investigation. Enough anomalies to question the established timeline, enough myths pointing in the same direction to consider that they might be based on real events. And there's the fact that we haven't looked in the most obvious place. The ocean floor, where Ice Age coastal cities would be, remains largely unexplored. We've made assumptions about what's possible in the past and then failed to investigate whether those assumptions are correct. This is bad science. Good science follows the evidence. Good science questions assumptions. Good science investigates anomalies rather than explaining them away. Good science is willing to revise theories when new data emerges. The resistance to investigating Hancock's hypothesis isn't scientific, it's institutional, ideological, and based on protecting established careers and frameworks. And that resistance is preventing us from potentially discovering something profound about our own history. But beyond the academic debate, beyond the question of whether an Ice Age civilization existed, there's a deeper truth that we need to confront. Catastrophic reset events are real. They've happened before, they'll happen again. The Toba supervolcano nearly wiped out humanity 74,000 years ago. The Younger Dryas event caused mass extinctions and climate chaos 12,800 years ago. Multiple impact craters on Earth show that asteroid strikes large enough to cause global devastation have occurred throughout history. And we're not immune. Right now, fragments of comets pass through Earth's orbital path regularly. We've identified some of the asteroids that pose potential threats, but not all of them. A large enough impact could trigger the same kind of catastrophe that occurred during the Younger Dryas. The explosion would be the least of our problems. The fires, the climate disruption, the crop failures, the collapse of civilization, those would kill far more people than the initial impact. We're also facing threats we've created ourselves. Climate change is destabilizing weather patterns, raising sea levels, and creating feedback loops that could trigger rapid, uncontrollable warming. Our coastal cities, where most of humanity lives, are vulnerable to sea level rise. Not 400 feet like at the end of the Ice Age, but even 20 or 30 feet would displace hundreds of millions of people and destroy trillions of dollars of infrastructure. Nuclear weapons remain ready to launch. A nuclear exchange between major powers would create a nuclear winter, blocking sunlight, crashing temperatures, destroying agriculture worldwide. The survivors would face conditions similar to what Younger Dryas survivors faced: sudden climate catastrophe, food shortages, societal collapse. Pandemics remain a constant threat. We've been lucky with COVID-19. The mortality rate could have been much higher, but engineered bioweapons exist, and natural pandemics with mortality rates of 50% or higher have occurred in history. A truly devastating pandemic could reduce human population by billions. And we've built a civilization that's completely dependent on systems that require constant maintenance. Our electrical grids, our water treatment plants, our food distribution networks, our medical supply chains, all of them are fragile and interconnected. A cascade failure in these systems could cause civilizational collapse even without a natural disaster or war triggering it. We're living on the edge of catastrophe just like every human civilization before us. The difference is that we've convinced ourselves we're immune. We have technology, we have knowledge, we're too advanced to fall like previous civilizations fell. But that's what every civilization believes before it falls. The Romans thought their empire was eternal. The Maya thought their cities would stand forever. The Bronze Age civilization thought they were secure. They all fell. Some collapsed so completely that it took centuries to recover. The knowledge they had was lost. The achievements they made were forgotten. If those civilizations could fall despite their sophistication, despite their confidence, despite their achievements, why do we think we're different? What makes us immune to the same forces that have destroyed every previous complex society? Nothing. We're not immune, we're not special, we're not protected by our technology. If anything, we're more vulnerable because we've become so specialized and dependent on systems that most people don't understand and can't maintain. So, this is what Hancock's hypothesis really challenges. Not just the timeline of civilization, but our assumption that civilization is permanent, that progress is linear, that we're always moving forward. The evidence suggests otherwise. The evidence suggests that humanity has risen and fallen multiple times, that we've achieved sophistication before and lost it, that catastrophe can erase nearly everything, and that we're not at the end of history. We're just in the latest chapter of a story that's much longer and more complex than we've acknowledged. What should we do with this knowledge? First, we should investigate seriously. Fund underwater archaeology of the continental shelves. Use LiDAR and ground penetrating radar and satellite surveys to search for hidden structures. Bring together geologists, archaeologists, mythologists, geneticists, and climatologists to examine the evidence without preconceptions. Look at the anomalies with fresh eyes. Question the established timeline. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. If there's nothing to find, fine, at least we looked. But if there is something there, if there really was an advanced Ice Age civilization that we've been dismissing for centuries, that discovery would be the most significant archaeological finding in human history. It would rewrite every textbook. It would change our understanding of who we are and where we came from. Second, we should preserve knowledge in durable forms. Digital storage is convenient but fragile. We need physical backups. Stone engravings, metal plates, information stored in forms that can survive catastrophe and remain readable for thousands of years without technology. Projects like the Memory of Mankind Archive, which stores information on ceramic tablets, are a start. We need more like it. Third, we should teach practical skills alongside technological skills. How to grow food, how to purify water, how to make fire, how to build shelter, how to preserve food, how to navigate without GPS, how to identify edible plants, basic survival skills that our ancestors knew but we've forgotten. These skills saved humanity after previous catastrophes. They could save us after the next one. Fourth, we should take catastrophic risks seriously. Climate change isn't a distant threat. It's happening now. We need to reduce emissions, prepare coastal cities for sea level rise, and develop technologies to survive in a changed climate. We need to improve our asteroid detection and deflection capabilities. We need to maintain and strengthen nuclear non-proliferation agreements. We need to regulate bioweapons research and prepare for pandemics. These aren't optional, they're existential necessities. Fifth, we should maintain civilizational resilience, decentralize systems so that failures don't cascade globally. Preserve redundancy even though it's less efficient, maintain knowledge in multiple locations. Build communities that can function without constant connection to global systems. Create buffers and backups. Sixth, we should remember humility. We're not the pinnacle of human achievement. We're the latest iteration of a species that's been rising and falling for hundreds of thousands of years. We have advantages our ancestors didn't have, but we also have vulnerabilities they didn't have. We should learn from their achievements and their failures. And we should recognize that we could fall just as they did if we're not careful. The myths are trying to tell us something. They are warning us that catastrophe is real, that civilization is fragile, that knowledge can be lost, that we're not immune to the forces that destroyed previous societies. We've been ignoring these warnings because they're wrapped in mythology, and because they contradict our comfortable assumptions. But maybe it's time to listen. Maybe it's time to take seriously the possibility that we're not the first advanced civilization Earth has produced, that others came before, that they achieved remarkable things, that they faced catastrophe, that they fell, that survivors preserved fragments of their knowledge in myths and monuments, that we've been rebuilding on foundations we don't fully recognize. Whether or not you accept Hancock's specific hypothesis about a globe-spanning ice age civilization, the broader truth remains. Humanity has been through multiple catastrophes. We've nearly gone extinct several times, we've lost knowledge and had to rebuild repeatedly. And we're facing new catastrophic risks right now that could send us back to a Stone Age existence within a single generation. The question isn't whether catastrophic reset events can happen. The genetic evidence, the geological evidence, and the historical evidence all prove they can and do happen. The question is whether we're prepared for the next one, and whether if our civilization falls, we'll leave enough evidence behind for future archaeologists to know we were here, or whether we'll become like the hypothetical Ice Age civilization. A few anomalies that don't fit the timeline, a few myths about the Golden Age, a few underwater structures that might be natural or might be artificial, fragments that future researchers will debate and dismiss because they don't fit the comfortable narrative that civilization only began a few thousand years ago. We have a choice. We can investigate our past honestly without letting institutional bias prevent us from looking where the evidence might be. We can acknowledge our fragility and prepare for potential catastrophes. We can preserve knowledge in durable forms. We can maintain practical skills. We can build resilience into our systems. Or we can continue assuming we're special, that we're immune, that catastrophe won't touch us because we're too advanced. We can continue dismissing the myths as fiction. We can continue ignoring the anomalies. We can continue refusing to look underwater because we've decided nothing could be there. And if we make that choice, if we choose comfort over truth and complacency over preparation, we'll likely end up like those who came before. A cautionary tale told by future civilizations, a myth about people who thought they were too sophisticated to fall, a few strange artifacts buried in the geological record, and maybe, if we're lucky, someone will find those artifacts 12,000 years from now and wonder if we were real, wonder what we achieved, wonder what we knew, wonder why we disappeared, wonder if anyone survived, and wonder if the myths they tell about us preserve any truth. Because the universe doesn't care about our pride, history doesn't care about our assumptions. The geological forces that destroyed previous civilizations are still operating. The cosmic threats that nearly wiped out humanity are still out there. And the clock is ticking. We can use the time we have to search for truth about our past, to prepare for threats to our future, to preserve what we've learned, and to build a civilization that might survive the next catastrophe. Or we can waste our time defending comfortable narratives, dismissing evidence that contradicts our assumptions, and assuming that the future will always look like the present. The choice is ours. But the consequences of that choice will be borne not just by us, but by every generation that comes after. If they come after, if there are any. The myths are screaming at us. Catastrophe is real. Civilizations fall, knowledge is lost. We're not the first, we probably won't be the last, but we could be the first to take the warnings seriously, to learn from those who came before, to prepare for what might come, to preserve what we've achieved, to ensure that if we fall, we don't fall into complete darkness, that some light survives, that some knowledge endures, that future generations have something to build on. The choice is ours, the time to make it is now. Because as the myths keep trying to tell us, the catastrophe doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wait for us to be ready. It just comes. And then everything changes. And the question becomes whether anyone survives to remember what was lost.